So, for the people who don't know Kegan, during his time in the Navy, he had a horrific accident which forced him to eject at the speed of sound before his fighter hit the water. And that was obviously incredibly damaging to the mind and body, obviously. He's also the only person who has survived an experience of this caliber. So, Kegan, would you be willing to talk us through what happened and tell me and the listeners, the story of this?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. So I was at VFA 143, the Pukin Dogs, after I finished the F-18 training rag, as they call their FRS.
Hmm.
So I was a I was a fairly new guy in the squadron still. I'd been in the squadron about 8 months. And I had largely played the small mouth, big ears role, which is a pretty good place to be as the new guy in a fighter squadron. A lot of listening and very little talking. And so that morning, it was January 15th, 2014. I was going on this flight to go do some basic fighter maneuvering or dogfighting. And one of the more senior JOs in the squadron came up. His call sign was Basil. Uh, and he said, you just haven't done anything that stupid to earn a call sign yet. And, there were guys that had joined the squadron after me at this point, and they had already had a bunch of call sign possibilities. The other guys that had joined with me already had call signs. My buddy, Dr. Ape and Fisty. And so I was overdue for one. And just so happened that Basil said that morning. I think he jinxed me for doing something crazy. Uh, Also, my buddy Tommy's at the SDO desk, so working the radios and the phone for the day. And behind him, he had put up on the whiteboard behind him all the positions of big tagged sharks that there's this app called Shark Tracker you can get on your phone. And he had done this as just for humor because Fisty is just hilarious dude, and he's always doing funny stuff to cheer everybody up, which is really invaluable when you're in a high stress environment of fighter aviation all the time. You need something to laugh at to survive a lot of the time. But he'd put this up and he's like, hey man, today would be a terrible day to eject. There's a 16-foot great white shark right underneath your working area you're going to be flying. Her name's Mary Lee. She's 16 feet long and weighs about 3,500 pounds. And so we joked about that. Anyways, got ready for the flight. Brief all went good. Got dressed and walked out to the aircraft. Swapped out an aircraft with what's called a hot switch. So another squadron mate, Sugar, was pulling into the line in the Super Hornet. He climbed on the ladder. Quick handshake and an update on any situation with the aircraft. The aircraft was all good to go. I climbed up the ladder and away we went. I was flying with my skipper that day, so my commanding officer, senior pilot in the squadron. And we went out and we did a few plugs of aerial refueling to check a pod that had just come out of maintenance. So it was basically this big, it's called an ARS, aerial refueling pod, that goes onto the bottom of another Super Hornet. So we can do air-to-air refueling within a squadron
Oh, yeah, I've
or an
seen
air
that.
wing.
Mm.
So buddy, Marshall Hipster's his call sign, was flying that aircraft. He flew up, put out a little drone that comes out behind it, a basket. And then the skipper and I, him and his jet and me and mine, we put our little fuel probe out on our nose. And then I got into position and took a few plugs of fuel off of the tanker. That was all going smooth. Got a few tries at it, a few practice plugs, disengaging, re-engaging, and all was good to go. Skipper kind of did the same thing. The pod was working great. We got some proficiency in that, as it's a perishable skill like many things in aviation. And with extra fuel and some extra time, we went off to set up on what was one of my favorite things to do in a Super Hornet. Kind of the thing that you probably think of when you think fighter pilot is aircraft trying to shoot down other aircraft in close quarters within a few miles of each other. And it's incredibly challenging, but incredibly fun. And I had just gotten my qualification with the JHEMIX helmet, which is a joint helmet mounted cueing system. And so with that, I was able to turn my head, and all of my weapon systems and flight information would track in a visor. So I could see basically over my shoulder, potentially engage another aircraft. So a really cool system, but just like any new piece of gear, it takes a little bit of practice to get used to, especially something that complex. And so I was still a little, distracted learning that new system that day. We did several sets, kind of went as expected. The skipper was kicking my ass. It's kind of like stepping in the ring with Mike Tyson. And a lot of times in fighter aviation, I'm out there fighting a dude who's been doing this for 15, 20 years. And he was a Top Gun graduate and extremely proficient. And, he kicked my butt, but through that, I was learning. Like, just when you get beat up in a fight, you start to learn stuff. And little by little, it was clicking. Nothing really that remarkable happened through all those fights. We would set up, we would fight, we'd call a knock it off once someone was clearly winning, which was the skipper that day every single time. And we set up for our last one. We had hit Joker fuel, which is the fuel state just before we get to what's called bingo fuel, which is where you have to basically head straight home at bingo. But we hit Joker fuel. We had just enough fuel and time to get one more set in, or at least a part of a set. So we set up down at about 12,500 feet. We were going 450 knots, and we were about a mile abeam each other. And the skipper called 3, 2, 1, fights on. We pitched in at each other, and we kind of came to a merge at nose low, and we were really going fast because we started pretty quickly. And, we started this fight at over 2 nautical miles up in the sky. So 12,500 feet. The ground wasn't a huge concern in my mind when we started the fight. And so when I met that merge, I decided to roll the aircraft inverted and continue my pull. Coming to the merge, I was kind of distracted trying to get my Jahemics to work and using the radar. And I was out of my normal habit pattern of scanning my airspeed and my altitude. And so rather than looking at the airspeed and altitude, I was kind of distracted, and I didn't realize how fast I had gotten. Rolled the jet inverted and continued that pull in the dive I was already started. And I started a dive straight down at the ocean. And when I got to about bullseye nose low, so pointed straight down at the water, the aircraft hit an airspeed that hit was called the G bucket. So the aircraft thought it had bombs on the wings that were actually not there. And it started to reduce the G that I could pull with the aircraft. So this was like going around a sharp corner in a sports car and then having the steering wheel kick back halfway. So I went from a nice crisp 7.5 G pull. I can feel that force on my head and my neck. My body weighs almost 8 times what it normally does. And with my head and my helmet combined weighing about 20 pounds or so, essentially I had like almost 160 pounds of force up on top of my neck. So I could feel that as I hit bullseye nose low, though, that all eased up. And that was the first cue that I got that something was awry. I remember that feeling, like everything just lifted, the jet stopped turning, and now I was just stuck in this dive. The aircraft was still turning slightly, but it was half the turning rate that it was doing prior to that, if not less. And so as I came through, this all just happens in a few seconds, by the way. I didn't have a whole lot of time to think this through. And next thing I knew, the ocean is just rushing up at me. And so all I knew was the jet's not doing what I was telling it to do. The stick is not responding how I wanted it to. I'm getting the hell out of here before I impact the ocean. And that was the only option at that point for me. I had already put the speed brake out. I had pulled the throttles to idle, but it just wasn't enough. And so the jet just shooting straight down to the ocean. I was going about 51 degrees nose low, so about that steep or so. And when I pulled the ejection handle, I was at just over 2,000 feet above the ocean. I was going 604 knots indicated airspeed, which is 0.95 indicated Mach number. So 95% the speed of sound. So right at the transonic sound barrier, essentially. That's about it's 695 miles per hour if you're going to do it in miles per hour. So I was going really fast, and a normal ejection is pretty violent. I mean, people's spines get compressed just from that rocket booster going off under you. And the instantaneous G of that rocket going off with the ejection seat is about 50 Gs instantaneously. And then you do a sustained G of about 14 Gs. So extremely high G forces that'll compress your spine in a normal ejection, with this being way outside the envelope for what you're supposed to eject. Although an injection is an emergency thing, so I didn't have another option other than die. But what really messed me up was the speed of that. As I came out of the aircraft, I hit that airflow that's going 700 miles per hour essentially. And, I think hurricanes start at like 70 miles per hour or so, or at least like a tropical storm's about 70 miles per hour. So, it's 10 times the wind speed that you would if you were to step out into a tropical storm or hurricane, like a Cat 1 hurricane. And, if you've ever stuck your arm out a car window going down the highway at 70 miles per hour, you know how that pulls your arm back pretty strong. That parasitic drag acting on you at 700 miles per hour. That force of parasitic drag is exponentially stronger. So something like 100 times the force that you would feel at 70 miles per hour impacted me all at once, along with that force of the ejection. And it just tore me apart. I mean, smashed my head. I broke my neck. I broke my left shoulder. Both my upper arms were just flailing like ragdoll. I broke both my upper arms. My right radius, this arm bone ripped through my brachial artery in my arm. This left forearm just shattered into pieces. I don't know if it smashed my face or hit the aircraft on the way out. Both my legs were just flailing around violently. I was wearing steel-toed boots, and essentially as my legs flailed around, the thought is that those became like maces, just smashing my tib fibs. So I had big open fractures on my legs. Chunks of my tibia were falling out of my leg, essentially chumming the water for Mary Lee. And so I was just, this is all just in a second, less than a second of impacting the air like that, just ragdolled me. It shredded my dry suit open. I was wearing a dry suit because we're flying over the Atlantic Ocean in January, and the buoy temperature was, I think it was 37 degrees Fahrenheit that day. So really cold water temperatures with freezing air temperatures. And so wearing a dry suit, but because of the speed, that thing shredded open. A lot of the gear on my survival vest ripped off. And not that I could have used it anyways, as my arms were just completely destroyed, a variety of nerve damage and all the brakes and everything. And luckily my parachute opened enough to slow me enough before I impacted the water that I didn't die in the impact with the ocean. And then that parachute that had just saved me sunk underneath the ocean and started to pull me under. We have a system that's supposed to automatically disconnect that. When it hit salt water, unfortunately, that system didn't operate properly. And so I was stuck to my parachute with no ability to reach up and manually disconnect it. And so the things that were supposed to be saving my life at this point, the parachute did, but then it sunk underneath the ocean currents and started yanking me under and drowning me alive. My dry suit filled up with that cold ocean water. And if you've ever felt water at that temperature, it feels like needles on your skin. And when your head goes under, it's like brain freeze. And so just extremely cold, destroyed, getting drowned. If you've ever been held under by a big wave surfing, or you want a breath of air and you can't get it, that's where I was at. And I spent about an hour and a half just getting drowned alive and bleeding out, and thinking that Mary Lee was going to come up at any minute and just finish me off. Luckily, my skipper saw my ejection. He became the on-scene commander, and he coordinated with a fishing vessel that was nearby, got them back to my position before he ran out of fuel, because he was on fumes, essentially. He had to hand off the on-scene commander some other aircraft in the area. But they were at least able to get a mark on my position, so people knew my approximate location with that. And once the fishing vessel got over, that gave a visual position of my rough location to all the other aircraft involved in the rescue. My beacon didn't function, so fortunately it was daytime, and fortunately that fishing vessel got over there due to the efforts of my skipper. It's quick thinking. And anyways, I'm bobbing around, getting pulled under. There's several helicopters dispatched, one from Coast Guard helicopter. I think there was a Coast Guard ship that showed up. And then there were two Navy H-60 Seahawk helicopters that showed up. And the first one showed up, and I think there was some sort of miscommunication. They jumped into the ocean. They thought I was on the boat that was there, the fishing boat, which I wasn't, unfortunately, at that point. And luckily, the other helicopter had showed up saw that and they're like, I don't think that's him. And the pilot saw my little head bobbing. So they flew over. The rescue swimmer Cheech jumped out, got in the ocean with me. He said he got in and he could see underneath the water, and he hooked into my, we have like a titanium D-ring on our harness. And he said he hooked into me to keep hold of where I was at. And he said once he was hooked in, that the force of the parachute, even with him being, the strong, fit rescue swimmer, he said it was just impossible to fight it. It just pulled both of us under. He said he remembered looking down and just seeing this blue abyss down below us. But he, his training kicked in. He got his knife out. He cut all the paracord loose, got me hooked into the helicopter and pulled up. I was in and out of consciousness through a lot of this, and I retrograde amnesia from a lot of it. But he said that, the rope was spinning and we're swaying around. There's all this prop wash, and they get me up into the helicopter. And he said the ride to the hospital was about 45 minutes, but it felt like 5 hours because the whole way there, I'm, in and out of consciousness, coding, so near death. But they got me back to Norfolk Hospital, which is a level 1 trauma center, fortunately. So as equipped as anybody could be to take care of a serious trauma like I was. And they had the freaking dream team of these surgeons on that day. And, little by little, they started to put me back together again. First, they treated me for severe hypothermia. By the time I got to the hospital, my core body temperature was about 87 degrees Fahrenheit, which I've heard now that at 86, you're dead. So I was within about a degree of dying from hypothermia, but the hypothermia actually kept me from bleeding to death from all my, my brachial arteries ripped open. So that thing's bleeding like crazy. Both my open leg fractures are bleeding. And they said, had my dry suit functioned, I would have bled to death in my dry suit, all warm and toasty. But they induced me into a coma. I had to, get a lot of blood transfusions. My kidneys were failing from rhabdomyosis, which, just the overwhelming trauma to my body was just shutting down my organs essentially. But they were able to stabilize me. They got me into surgery, and I spent the next week undergoing over a dozen trauma surgeries where they rebuilt my skeleton with titanium rods and screws and plates. And they did an artery bypass on my brachial artery, fasciotomies on all 4 extremities. So a lot of limb salvage procedures. I was very fortunate that they were able to do everything they did. After a week of all that, they were trying to get me out of the induced coma, but I just wasn't coming to. Combination of the drugs, the head injury, the trauma, I just wasn't waking up. And so a lot of my squadron mates are there at the hospital along with my family at that point. My mom and dad had showed up, and they're all in the waiting room, just kind of like waiting to hear if I'm going to pull through. And my friends, I was a kiteboard instructor for a little bit while I was in college, and my friends at Bronia Kiteboarding, which is now M22, they gave me the nickname Scrappy. And my friend Matt, who's a co-owner with his brother Kegan of that company that I was a kiteboard instructor for, he always called me Scrappy, and he was kind of like they were both like a big brothers to me. But in the Navy, if something really bad happens, you're supposed to put somebody that you trust to deal with the emergency situation. And I thought Matt would be the perfect guy for that. And so I had put him as a contact if there was ever something terrible that happened to me on that letter, and gave that to my skipper, not thinking that they would ever need to open this letter. But when this happened, the skipper opened that letter and it had Matt's contact information. So he called Matt, and I guess the first thing Matt says, "Are you talking about Scrappy?" And so my skipper thought Scrappy was really funny. He told that to everybody in the squadron when he got back to kind of cheer everybody up. And then they were kind of wondering if I was going to pull through. And Basil, I think is the guy in my squadron who said, he's a scrappy motherfucker. He'll be all right. And so scrappy motherfucker stuck. They condensed that down to SMurF as a makeshift acronym. And then because it's the Navy, you have to have a politically correct cover story for your call sign if it involves anything inappropriate, like the word fuck. So they said I'm a short guy who turned blue in the ocean from hypothermia is the official reason why I'm SMurF, but it's really because I'm a scrappy motherfucker. So anyways, another week went by. I eventually came out of that comatose state, and I really had no idea where I was at or what had happened. I had no memory of it at that point. I was on just a massive amount of drugs. I mean, they had me on fentanyl and Dilaudid and oxycodone and OxyContin and you know, it's like they just kept putting me on more and more stuff for pain management. But little by little, you know, I like started to come to and realize where I was at. I remember my squadron mates were in there going, hey, you know, we're just happy to see you're alive. I'm like, I got to get back to work, like get a wheelchair and get me out of here. Like, I didn't realize how damaged I was. I was from the head injury, I think, and the drugs. I was really out of it. And it took a few months for me to start to regain much mental function. But they drove me in an ambulance down to Richmond, Virginia eventually. And I spent 3 months rehabilitating in a trauma center there, relearning how to use my arms. I speech therapy, vision therapy, kinesiotherapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, you name it, all day, every day was basically just working to get better. And I really wanted to get better. You know, I had medical staff come in and say, you know, you're never going to walk again. You're never going to use your arms again. Your flying career is over for sure. But every time they would say that stuff, there was this little thing inside of me that was like, fuck that. I'm going to prove all these people wrong. And so that was my motivation every day, was just like try to wiggle a little bit. And when I came to, I was paralyzed. Like I couldn't move anything, but little by little, you know, I was starting to able to scooch to the bottom of the bed. Another big motivator. I mean, I was shitting on myself, and I had to have these corpsmen come and clean me off, which was pretty unpleasant. So I just wanted to get my function back. And little by little, though, keeping at it with all the therapy, family support. I was getting food from the outside world, luckily, because the VA food was just garbage, in short, unfortunately. It was kind of funny. Well, not funny, but I thought it was odd that, you know, they spend all this money on this big facility and all this equipment and all these therapists and everything. And then the most important part is probably getting some sleep and getting good food. And they wake you up all night to take your vitals, and then they feed you garbage food. So it's like, all right, there's something that could use a little improvement for sure. But overall, I was very fortunate to be there. They have an excellent staff. They got me back together to the point where I could get around on a walker. And then I spent the next 2 years rehabilitating through outpatient therapy and largely on my own. And one of my friends in the squadron, Smugla, his wife happened to be a physical therapist, affectionately known as Aunt Smugs or Amanda. She started working with me outside of, you know, her clinical setting. And, you know, the first day she showed up with this Nalgene bottle, and on the side of it, it said patient's tears. And so I knew she was about to kick my ass, which was perfect because I was all about that kind of workout prior to this accident. And so I was using that same, you know, intensity in my workouts, even though I could barely do anything that I could do before. But little by little, she beat my ass into shape. My buddies put me under their wing and were taking me out surfing as soon as they could. My buddy Spicoli and Neil and Vinny and Rich and all these guys were getting me out mountain biking and like doing all this stuff again. And a lot of it I could hardly do. Like I could barely use the brake on the mountain bike. I could barely paddle in the surf, and I got beat up a bunch by waves. But little by little, that stuff started to get me better. I was on a massive amount of drugs. So despite the pain management clinic basically telling me you just need to stay on that stuff, I just started to taper myself off. At that point, I was on gabapentin, which is a pretty heavy duty nerve medication was really addictive for me, and oxycodone, oxycontin, amitriptyline, tramadol, trazodone. I mean, the list goes on of all the shit that they were pumping me up with. And getting off of that stuff was miserable. I mean, going through the withdrawals, but I did it. And 2 years later, I was able to max out the Navy's physical fitness standards, and I went back to flying Super Hornets. And that's kind of where like the Disney happy ending version would end, I think. Unfortunately, you know, after about a year and a half of being back flying, I started to experience more intense symptoms from a TBI I came back from a flight, and I thought maybe it was what was happening was decompression sickness, which can happen in the Super Hornet if the pressurization system malfunctions. So first thought maybe that was it. They put me into a pressurization chamber, a hyperbaric chamber at a dive center nearby where we were that day, and that helped a little bit. But when I got back from that detachment to the place where I was stationed at that point, which was NAS Lemoore in California with VFA 136 Nighthawks, I went into medical, which was the last thing I wanted to have to do, because I already had this stack of medical waivers that I fought for to get back, and all this help to get me back. And so to go in and be like, something is wrong and I might not be able to fly again, was extremely difficult. But I didn't want to hurt anybody. I didn't want to get somebody injured or killed or kill myself by making a mistake or crashing another aircraft. So I went in, and the advice I got there was I had to go see the psych department, because, they focused on this cognitive impairments that I was having, which were largely, I couldn't sleep. My memory was gone. I was having a really hard time focusing. And anyways, they started to see me at the psych department, and the answer was largely more pharmaceutical medications. And they put me on a drug eventually called quetiapine to help me sleep. It's an antipsychotic medication, also called Seroquel. And they put me on that, and it was to help me sleep initially. And it didn't take very long. I started to have all the little, I had like a little bit of paranoia and a little bit of hypervigilance along with the mental dysfunction, which retrospectively was largely TBI related, but they focused on a PTSD diagnosis, and the focus was this medication, and it just started to exacerbate things. And next thing I knew, I was going into these psychoses. I couldn't distinguish between my reality and what was just made up in my head. I went to the commissary with my wife, and everybody in there had these ghoulish faces and big black eyes, and everybody was staring at me, and there were these monsters that were like trying to suck my soul out of me, essentially. And as we left base, my wife was driving, and I looked back, and it looked like the entire base had just ripped out of the ground, and there's all this rebar and dirt and boulders falling, and there was this black pit. It was like this gateway to hell had opened underneath the base. And of course, I'm just hallucinating all this stuff. Sometimes the hallucinations were really exciting. Like, I thought my wife was a secret agent who'd come to save me. I thought she was Carrie Matheson from Homeland. And it changed minute by minute, day to day. Sometimes I was kind of back to normal. Other times I thought I was in the Truman Show, where everybody was, watching me and listening to me and tailoring everything to me. And anyways, this was not conducive to flying. And unfortunately, things just continued to degrade. Eventually, I was medically retired, and I moved back to Northern Michigan with my family. And they just kept upping the dose of quetiapine as the only option really for me to get better. And I had my dose increased from 300 milligrams per night up to 450 milligrams of this quetiapine. And that was when I went into the most violent psychosis I had yet. Anyways, I ended up in the mental hospital. I ended up down in the Battle Creek VA inpatient psych facility. I had a pretty miserable experience there, being kind of drugged against my will, poor sleep, poor food, not the place to rehabilitate. Luckily, I had a lot of family support that got me out of there eventually. And when I got back, I was just broken. I was this depressed shell of a human who I once been. I couldn't focus. And luckily, I stumbled upon psychedelic therapy, and I found an organization called Vet Solutions. I know you spoke with Marcus Capone.
Yes, yeah.
And I sent them an email. I knew I didn't really qualify for their program. I wasn't special forces. I didn't have 2 combat tours, but I was like, this seems like a reasonable direction to go. I had stumbled through the book, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, and that really stuck with me. And I mean, stumbled because I could only read about a paragraph at a time before I had to take a break from it, because my cognitive abilities were so poor at that point. But stumbled through it, found vet solutions just through searching the internet. And I really wanted to try psychedelic therapy because I thought that that maybe helped, because I had tried so much other stuff that wasn't helping, largely based on medication. And they sent me an email back kind of like, hey, I understand from listening to Marcus and talking to Marcus at this point, I've heard how he, it's like Schindler's List for him and Amber, where they have all these people that need the therapy, but they can only give it to so many. And so I didn't get to go to his program, but he put me in contact with Warrior Angels Foundation, which is run by a former Green Beret, Andrew Marr, and his brother Adam, who's a former attack helicopter pilot. Great dudes. They were putting together an event based off of David Goggins' 4x4x48 challenge, which was run 4 miles every 4 hours for 48 hours straight. And they had a fundraiser page going. I put a little bit about my story up on there. And before I knew it, there was a bunch of attention and people were donating a lot to my page. And so, Adam called me up and he's like, hey, do you want to come down to Texas and do the event? And I was like, absolutely. And when I got down there, I was still in pretty rough shape mentally. I had just kind of weaned myself off of the psych medication against the advice of my psychiatrist, and my family was all very concerned. But when I got down there, I met this whole community of military members, largely special forces types, Green Berets, Marine radars, SEALs, all these guys. And they had very similar stories and experiences to me as far as dealing with a brain injury and trauma, and then being overprescribed these medications and having it make them way worse. And they all had very similar stories. And so I realized that I was on the right path, and I was invited into this community of people who saw through the bullshit of the pharmaceutical industry, and that was not the answer. And so, had a great event, ran 48 miles with all these guys, made a bunch of really good friends and close contacts there, and started a different path to healing, which is largely based on getting off the pharmaceutical crap. That stuff might be useful in the very short term, but long term, it is so damaging. Went to a very holistic focus with supplementation with nutraceuticals. I had already focused on improving my diet, exercise, and little by little, those things came together. And then I was invited by Jesse Gould, who runs Heroic Hearts, down to Peru. And I did an ayahuasca retreat there, which is a very potent psychedelic. And that, in short, I felt helped to heal my soul and gave me this reset that I needed to start a new direction in my life in so many ways emotionally. And it opened me back up. I had been just cut off from my emotions from so long, from it just being miserable and being in pain and all the emotional stuff that I had going on. I had just shut that down, and ayahuasca helped to open that door back up so I could feel positive emotions. Because unfortunately, when you shut down all the bad stuff, all the good stuff goes away too a lot of the time. So, I wasn't feeling compassion for my kids and my wife and like everybody. I was just this alone, broken soul. And the ayahuasca helped to change that. Defenders of Freedom, run by Donna Cranston, invited me down to Resiliency Brain Clinic. There I did a 2-week TBI clinic, thanks to Kelsey Sharon, who got me in touch with them. And she, Doc G and Michelle and Jay and all those guys down there put me through 2 weeks of this training. And it was largely just eye movements and these very simple procedures that they could have this on every military base. And after I got out of that, they did testing at the beginning, at the end. I had massive cognitive functioning improvements in 2 weeks. And looking back at it, I think like if I had gotten that kind of treatment when I started displaying the symptoms that my TBI were giving me back while I was still flying, I think I would likely still be flying for the military. But anyways, it's been a huge turnaround, and I'm kind of getting my life back, rekindling my romance. I know that was a long answer, but there's a lot of stuff that happened. But yeah, I'm just kind of on a new path to healing, and it's been tremendously beneficial for me and the people that I've seen utilizing these techniques.
Man, I mean, that actually is the most incredible story I've ever heard. And reading up about it, reading the facts, listening to the stuff that people have said, it doesn't do it justice to what you've just said. It's absolutely incredible, and I can't even imagine how tough mentally you'd have to be to get through that sort of a thing. And your family too. They must have really gone through that with you as well. And I think you guys have done a
Oh yeah.
fantastic job to get back to where you were. And I mean, everything that could have gone wrong just went wrong there. It's incredible. And I know you said about jinxing it, but it seems like that's almost what happened. But I'm just so glad that you're where you are now, and looking at your Instagram and stuff you're doing, all the biking and the running. It's so inspiring. And you know what? My third question was going to be about your recovery and stuff, but I feel like you've kind of answered
Sorry,
that. So
I kind of
honestly,
jumped ahead there.
I'm going to change that question. What I want to know really is, what did it take for you to dig in mentally when you were bobbing around freezing cold, probably in the most painful, excruciating way? What did it take to get through that? Because I mean, an hour and a half is a long time. And I know people say time flies when you're having fun, and the opposite is very true. So
Sure.
honestly, how did you manage to do that? How did you get through it and stay conscious and stuff and keep above water?
I was in and out of consciousness a lot of it, and I inhaled a lot of salt water,
Mm.
and there was just some will to live still in me somehow, and I was fortunate enough to somehow get to the surface on occasion, cough out a bunch of water, get a breath before I got pulled under again, and just it was just full up survival mode at that point. Um, to get through that was just, I guess, just survival mode. But the real sort of mental fortitude, I think, was developed kind of after I woke up in the hospital and was like, shit, I'm completely destroyed. My body is paralyzed. I just crashed an $89 million fighter jet. Um, you know, it would have been so easy at that point to just say, my life is over. I fucked up, and fuck it, I don't care anymore. And I could have just buried myself in prescription drugs. I could have stopped caring, and that happens to people in that situation for sure. But I just had this fight in me still that was like, you know what? I think I can I think I can do this. I know I can't do that right now, but maybe I can do this. Maybe I can wiggle my foot. Maybe I can sit up in the bed if I keep at it. And it was just, I became very focused on the day to day, just what can I do today? What
That,
can I do? And I think by breaking this massive goal of recovering into little bites that I just stuck at every day with discipline and focus, that's what rebuilt me, was just keeping at it and keeping that hope alive. And don't get me wrong, I had periods where I lost hope, especially while I was going through that medical board, and it looked like my flying was future was over. My career that I had worked so hard for was disappearing, and being in and out of these psychoses and depressed. I almost took my Glock out of my end table and put it in my mouth. And I was even contemplating what's the gun oil going to taste like in my mouth, and what's the barrel going to feel like in my teeth. And the only thing that kept me out of that was my little newborn son was laying next to me in bed with my wife, and I couldn't do that to them, and I didn't want to wake them up with the gunshot. And I started to think, like, what would happen if I did that? They would wake up and have dad all over the wall. Like, that would be the worst thing I could do to my family. And so a lot of it was my family got me through it. Um, and somehow my wife stuck with me through all of this, and she's a freaking hero for doing so. I mean, I had just become a different miserable human being for a long time. My personality had changed. Um, and so I was just very fortunate all around to be here. The amount of support and things that I've been fortunate to stumble upon, the help I've gotten, and especially in this last year through all these nonprofit organizations, I've just been so fortunate, you know, but it's just been that just sticking through it. And even if all that means is just not pulling a trigger, you know, maybe that's all you can do that day. I'm just not going to pull that trigger.